Let me introduce our guest for this edition of the debate. Journalist and political analyst Hafsa Kara-Mustapha joins us from London. We have Mideast and South Asia Vice Presidents from Stratfor, Kamran Bokhari, who joins us from Toronto. I'd like to welcome both of our guests. I start with you, Kamran Bokhari. Can you please explain who is ruling Libya?
That is the question. No one's ruling Libya. I mean, Libya as a whole, as a sovereign country, does not have the typical government that you will find in other places, even in weak states, even in comparison to many other weak states like Afghanistan. Libya is more of an anarchic situation. You have two rival bodies, two rival centers of power with their parliaments struggling for power, and in between them there are militias.
Well, how did this come about, Hafsa Kara-Mustapha? Why do you attribute Libya to have reached the point that it is right now?
Well, it's a very simple answer to that. It's the NATO onslaught of 2011. There was a popular uprising back in February, which could have led to some sort of organic revolution, but instead, within weeks, there was a call for foreign intervention, which turned into a NATO onslaught, which inevitably led to 6 months of bombing campaign. Now, we know for a fact, and we've had the examples of Iraq in the past and Afghanistan, that American bombing campaigns simply lead to a power vacuum that inevitably leads to this type of chaos. We've seen Somalia actually descend into a failed state scenario, but that actually took over 30 years. Within 3 years, Libya's entire infrastructures were destroyed, thousands have been killed, and of course now it's host to scores of various militias affiliated to the worst terrorist organizations we know in the region.
Do you think that this is something that was anticipated, Kamran Bokhari, when you have the outside forces at that point in 2011, such as NATO and the US, which led the campaign, to have anticipated? I mean, we're looking at three forces here, two governments, also the major force of Ansar al-Sharia, which is that al-Qaeda offshoot, right now vying for power in the country. Where do you see this going in terms of there being any type of rule of law? Because as it stands, many are speculating this is not only a failed state, but a civil war that's been going on now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is a failed state, but I would disagree with my co-panelist that, it's not fair to lay all the blame on NATO and the United States or the West in general, because we have to look at what existed before. What existed before was essentially a one-man regime, that of Muammar al-Gaddafi. There were no institutions. He deliberately kept the army weak. It was barely an institution, which is why it basically crumbled soon after the uprising began during the Arab Spring months into 2011. Mind you, that well before NATO began its bombing, the Libyan military, the military establishment of Muammar al-Gaddafi, broke apart on its own without any interference from the outside. And I would argue that those who the NATO intervention was to try and manage what was really, emerging even at that time as a very, very difficult situation. So this was anticipated. Sometimes there are difficult situations, and I think it's really unfair to lump it with Iraq and Afghanistan. And in fact, I'd argue that in Iraq and Afghanistan, you have a far better situation. And I don't know what we can accomplish by polemical arguments.
I think I found 4 reactions from you there, the second one being the most severe. Go ahead. Hafsa Kara-Mustapha.
Well, absolutely. I mean, had the institutions, the military institutions, crumbled prior to the revolution, then who did the fighting for the best part of 6 months? The NATO onslaught lasted for 6 months. That means that there were numerous people within Libya who remained loyal to the Jamhuriya and who fought against this foreign intervention. Now, the criticism of Gaddafi is really irrelevant here. We're not talking about the regime or the policies of Gaddafi. We're talking about an organic revolution that might have remained a success had it been left within Libyan hands, but it's the foreign intervention that is wrong. Now, I'm sorry, but the idea that somehow there is no blame to pin on the US is absolutely ridiculous. As I've mentioned, we've had the Afghanistan example, we've had Iraq, which now has given us the result that is ISIS. We've had also Somalia, and we have Libya. And just one last point, I'd have to say, if the US doesn't have a deliberate policy of divide and ruin within the Middle East, given its numerous mistakes across the region, then either A, this is a deliberate matter of policy, or B, the United States is led by the most inept and efficient politicians in human history, really, because the results are actually blatant to anyone who knows the Middle East. Every single American intervention has led to excess bloodshed and chaos.
Kamran Bokhari, there was two answers there. You could pick option A or B, or your reaction to Hafsa Kara-Mustapha in general.
I'll just reiterate that. Look, it's become fashionable to sort of lay blame and point fingers at the United States or the West. There's a lot of blame to go around, but to sort of really one-sided view, just lay all the blame on one side and not take into account the fact that she doesn't want to talk about what Gaddafi was doing, speaks volumes about how this is sort of, this whole discourse is being shifted from a pure analytical and honest, objective analytical process to one that is just, mudslinging and the usual polemical diatribe.
Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, go ahead.
I'm sorry, but we're not, again, I insist, we're not talking about the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. I am not remotely speaking about what has happened in the 42 years. I'm speaking about the consequences of a NATO onslaught. And regardless what you may think of Gaddafi, he offered to negotiate. And the day the NATO pounding started, Jacob Zuma was flying into Tripoli to broker peace talks. And instead of allowing any form of peace talks, NATO was pounding. Now, just to give you an example, next door to Libya, there is the state of Tunisia. Now, they've had a purely organic revolution, no foreign intervention, no Western military. And as a result, 3 years on, they've had successful elections, they've had parliamentary change, they're transitional, and it's a proper success story of a post-revolutionary that is done by people, from the people. Now, this idea that we cannot blame America by apologists of warmongering nations such as America that has been involved in a war in every single conflict for the past 52 years since the Second World War, I think is utterly ridiculous. I think we have to note that the foreign policy of America is responsible for a lot of bloodshed, and in particular in my part of the world, which is the Arab world.
Kamran Bokhari, go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to say, look, I'm not here to defend anybody. All I want is a more level and a balanced analysis, and I think I'm not going to get that because sadly my co-panelist has made up her mind, and this is for her. This is an opportunity to go bash America and the West again, but we're not going to look deep inside into what was going on. We don't want to even talk about that. We're always looking for exogenous factors to blame for the misery of the Arab world. We're not going to look endogenously and say, so what was wrong there? And, comparing Tunisia and talking about an organic revolution in Libya, that's a stretch. That's comparing apples and oranges. There's centuries of divergent history that separate Libya from Tunisia. But again, we're not going to talk about that, but we want to just conveniently lay blame on the West.
Well, go ahead, defend the record of Libya then. I'm listening. Please tell me how the NATO intervention has benefited Libya. I'm completely open to listening to your arguments.
Again, you're creating a straw man. I'm not saying that NATO benefited, but I'm saying is that to blame whatever happened in Libya solely on the West and its bombing in the form of the NATO airstrikes, which you're calling a 6-month massive bombing campaign. I don't recall it as such. There were limited airstrikes, and if you want to describe it in some other way, then that's fine.
Oh my God, the entire infrastructure of Western Libya has been destroyed. 42 years of building, of nation building, was destroyed as a result of the NATO onslaught. How can you deny the existence? And since you want to take this to an academic level, then I will ask you a very simple question, Mr. Bokhari. Please give me a simple figure. How many people died as a result of the NATO onslaught? It's a very simple question, given that anywhere else, when Westerners die, we have precise figures. So please tell me how many people died as a result of the NATO-led onslaught.
Honestly, I don't know off the top of my head. I'm going to be really honest with you. I don't know off the top.
Of course, it's only darkies, who cares?
No, but no, it's not about, see, again, you're assuming intent. You're assuming, I find these interviews really ridiculous where one side has to bash the other one and, go after these diatribes. And this is why I don't appear on PressTV that much, because, this is, substandard conversation.
Well, when you're an apologist for American foreign policy, I think that's the price you'll have to pay. People are sick and tired of the consequences of American foreign policies, and when people such as yourself become the fig leaf of its policies, I think you have to bear the brunt of that.
You see, this is the kind of substandard conversation that we have. Go read my writings.
Give us your arguments, Mr. Bokhari. I'm listening.
I'm not an apologist. Go read my writings. They speak for themselves. They're available publicly. You go read them. I don't think you've ever read what I've written.
We're here to talk about Libya. Give us your arguments about Libya. Again, I'm listening.
You said that I'm an apologist. You said that I'm an apologist for the United States. I responded to you saying, no, I'm not. I have the right to defend myself when being attacked unfairly,
Absolutely.
right or wrong?
Yes,
okay.
you do.
So,
absolutely, but you said that it was pointless to actually.
All I'm saying is that let's not talk about Libya only from the prism of NATO bombings. Let's talk about Libya from other points of view as well. What were the people doing? What was the civil war about? What were the tribes doing? You know, there are lots of forces on the ground that we just cannot ignore.
So are you suggesting that this situation is not a result of the NATO onslaught?
Look, everybody has a contribution to it, but let's be honest. NATO bombing ceased a long time ago, and it was limited in scope. It's not what we see in we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan that you conveniently compared to. I'm saying that what about the endogenous forces? What are the people inside Libya? There is no Libyan nation, you know, right now. Why? Because there are factions.
When you have
do with NATO. They have nothing to do with NATO.
When you have a bombing campaign that leaves a power vacuum in any country, and in particular countries that are prone to turmoil, you will see specifically these problems. In Iraq, for 10 years, we've had various governments, and now we've had, as a result of the invasion, we've had a mass diaspora of Iraqi Christians, we've had the emergence of ISIS. You cannot deny that that is a direct consequence of the 2003-led invasion. The Taliban are still strong, and the problems have swept to Pakistan. That is, again, a direct consequence of American intervention. So coming back to Libya, one cannot look at the chaos in Libya and actually claim that is in no way the responsibility in NATO, when it is precisely the NATO pounding campaign that led to a power vacuum that consequently led to this situation.
Okay, we've had a few minutes on this. Hold on a second, Kamran Bokhari.
No, can I get my word in there, sir,
yeah,
please?
Sure, go ahead. Okay. So we can move on. Go ahead.
Yeah, here's the point. I'm not absolving NATO. All I'm saying is there's a difference between absolving NATO and saying let's be a bit more fair, let's look at other factors. That's all I'm saying here.
Okay, let's look at some other factors. Kamran Bokhari, I'll start with you. Outside powers, give us your thought. We have Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt, it appears, on one side, and then you have, Qatar and Turkey on the other. Tell us your thoughts on those countries and how they're influencing events.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that intervention we should focus on that intervention because that's in the here and now, and that intervention is actually exploiting a fault line that could be described as Islamist versus non-Islamist, you know, the East versus the West, you know, however you want to do it. I mean, they're supporting a faction, the UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, and that's having an impact on the ground. Part of it is their conflict, their competition with fellow GCC state Qatar and Turkey, which is supporting the rival factions. So it's a proxy war. So again, you know, here's an example of how there are regional endogenous factors that are shaping Libya, as opposed to the NATO bombing that happened, you know, several years ago.
Well, what is the U.S. role, Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, in this proxy war?
Well, first of all, the countries that both yourself and Mr. Bokhari have mentioned, namely Turkey and the US, have one major thing in common. They're both close allies of the US, obviously. Turkey is a NATO country, and Saudi Arabia is probably the closest ally of the US in the Arab world, and very much openly responsible for funding a lot of the terrorist groups that are operating across the region, and again creating havoc across the region, something which my co-panelist refuses to acknowledge, or rather refuses to link to the US, although of course we know very much of the ties that these countries have with the United States, and of course the funding that they receive from countries. So their responsibility, whether directly or indirectly, again, has to be linked to both the US's foreign policy, but as well including the NATO onslaught, which, it has to be said and repeated, deprived Libya of having perhaps a very fair and normal election. Let's not forget that Gaddafi, despite all the criticism, offered to hold elections in the September of that year, and all Western countries who were hell-bent on having their usual war refused and instead voted for the resolution 1973, which initially was supposed to be obviously a no-fly zone, but turned into the traditional regime change operation the West is so keen on, often in the Arab world.
Kamran Bokhari, go ahead.
I mean, again, all I can do is smile and find this very hilarious because, again, the propensity of my co-panelists to just focus on what the West did. And you know, this is hilarious to say that Colonel Gaddafi offered free and fair elections or negotiations. He was fighting for his life because of the civil war, because of the suppression that he did in his country, and because of the uprising from people.
So what he was fighting for? He offered to organize elections, and at least that would have been better than a bombing campaign and the ensuing power vacuum that followed.
Ma'am, here's the thing.
The idea that you cannot negotiate with Gaddafi is absolutely wrong. He gave back Megrahi to the Scottish courts. He agreed to have nuclear inspectors to enter.
Kamran Bokhari, you have a question. You have a question for Hafsa Kara-Mustapha. Go ahead. Kamran Bokhari, your question.
If she will allow me, I'd like to ask a question. Ma'am, what would your response be to a person who has, you know, basically looted and pillaged your country, and would you trust that person for elections? This is like asking Assad to hold free and fair elections.
30 seconds.
Well, would I? No. So instead, I should trust NATO that goes around pounding countries for the sake of it, that is led by the most imperialist nations in the world. Is that the option I prefer? No, I would rather actually negotiate with the leader of my country and find a middle ground solution. Because the bottom line is, if you know very well, but if you know Libya, you would know that it's divided between the people of Benghazi and the people of Tripoli. And Tripoli was loyal to Gaddafi, Benghazi wasn't. But at the end of the day, the two factions would have had to sit together and negotiate. Just in fact, as the opposition in Syria will have to sit down with the Assad loyalists because both sides are Syrian and they have nowhere else to go. The worst thing that could happen once again in the Arab world is to invite Western intervention that has left a trail of bloodshed and destruction.
I'm not supporting Western intervention, and I must say, Libyans disagree with you.
All right. It seems like
they don't. No, they don't.
Okay. I think I can squeeze one more question in here to get 30 seconds. Your thoughts on Khalifa Haftar, Kamran Bokhari? 30 seconds.
I mean, clearly he's a stakeholder.
Shall I start?
Go ahead, Kamran Bokhari. 30 seconds.
He's a stakeholder. He's being supported by the Saudis, the Egyptians, and the UAE. He's trying to move out of the East into the West, but right now he's pinned down in the East. And it remains to be seen whether he can be a player or not.
Hafsa Kara-Mustapha, same question, 30 seconds, please.
Well, against Chad, I mean, having an army of thousands, he wasn't able to defeat a group of 300. So he's rather a farcical figure, unfortunately. Sadly, given the total chaos Libya is in, he's obviously the best option out of absolutely the worst. It's pretty much a case of offering Libyans whether they prefer AIDS or Ebola. Sadly for them, they don't really have much choice, and Haftar does appear to be the best option.
Thank you very much, journalist and political analyst Hafsa Kara-Mustapha there from London. Thank you very much, Mideast and South Asia Vice President at Stratfor, Kamran Bokhari, spoke to us from Toronto. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate.